really, I just want to start with this question because I think it's a good place to start. Um, what is a story? If you're in here and you're not exactly sure what a story even is, don't worry, we can help you as well. What a story is really an opportunity for someone who understands the customer's needs to communicate that to the people who are going to be doing the work. And so we need to write stories in a way that is easily consumable by software engineers and testers so that they have as much information as they need to code a thing that meets the customer's need. And if you think about it, you're kind of playing a telephone game here where the customer is talking about what they need. The product person is trying to then interpret that and then communicate that into written language and then communicate that to your development team, which includes Dev and QA, in order to write the code and write the tests that represent what that original person said. So there's lots of ways to go for that to go awry. But what we're talking about here is a story. And when I say story, I use that term very loosely. I don't mean exactly, if you're familiar with the as a blank, I need to blank, so that blank. I don't mean exactly that. I mean that plus all the acceptance criteria that go along with it. So it's the item that you need, and it really just means what is the written form of this outcome that we want to achieve for a particular kind of user. And so that's what I mean about story. And so it's all the as a blanks wrapped up with the acceptance criteria. And this is just a piece of work that flows through the system for devs to code. The next one, okay, so what is a good story? Well, what we're going for here with stories is, and when I say a good story, this whole seminar is about writing good small stories. It needs to be, in my book, crystal clear. It needs to be well defined. In other words, it is immediately obvious to the people doing the work what to code and what to test. Really, your grandmother should understand what you're trying to accomplish here, and it should be nice and small as well, so it's easily consumable. It's not hugely complex. It probably just takes a couple of days or less to complete, and it might be tiny, but it is written in a kind of a natural language so that anybody who reads it, including people in the business, can not have to sit through a bunch of technical jargon, and they know exactly what is meant to be accomplished in this little tiny chunk of work. And the most obvious thing that needs to be contained in a story is, what's your intent? What do we want to have happen here? So in addition to that, it's not all about like what, it's also about the why. We want to be sure that we're including, why are we even doing this work? How does it link to the strategy? How does it add value? How does it make our customers' life better? How does it earn our customer more money? Or whatever that why is that you're doing the work. Super important to include it, because if you can't think of the why, it's a great question to ask your business partners if you're in IT. So when is a story ready? We've talked about what a story is. We've talked about now some criteria for thinking about what is a good story. And now you kind of have to know, well, okay, so at some point the story needs to move to a dev team and get an estimate, a story point estimate. And if you're interested in story points, by the way, there's another webinar on story pointing, very similar to this, with lots of questions about story pointing. There are videos out there. You can go to the Lightspeed website and find those. We're not going to talk too much about story points in this one, but rest assured, it's all out there. So when is a story ready? And there's an acronym out there that's very helpful if you haven't heard of it. It's called INVEST, INVEST. And what INVEST stands for is the ways in which you can create a good story. It's kind of like, you don't have to be very draconian about it, but it's kind of like a little checkbox. Is the story these things? Then there's a good chance that it's ready. And so it's INVEST. The I is independent, meaning that it's kind of a standalone story. It is negotiable. That's the N. That means that you didn't contract to have this work. You really, the exact requirements can and should be discussed with the dev team in case there's better ways to implement, or quicker ways, or more efficient ways, or safer ways, or more performant ways. This has to be a conversation. So it's that N really represents the way of thinking that it's not simply your business owners throw something over the wall to IT and then IT just has to code whatever's there. The N really means, well, let's talk about this because maybe we can achieve the same outcome why the why is very important, with perhaps a different technology that we can do more safely and more quickly. V is valuable. Some people also think of this to mean vertical, which means you're taking a vertical slice. So it's UI, middle tier, and back end. It's not just a story about UI. It needs to be estimatable. Again, story pointing, it needs to be clear what the scope of the work is. It needs to be small, and we're going to talk a lot about what small means here, obviously, but it does need to be a small story. You're going to want several of these in a sprint or in your iteration, in your 2-week time period, whatever you want to call it. So small is the S there. We'll talk more about that. And then T is testable. And that just means that this is something we can test. It doesn't mean that you have to have your testing environment set up. It doesn't mean that you have to have the tooling in place. Like, if you have to test APIs and you're in a Postmaster, I mean, that's fine. It just has to be testable, assuming that all of those things are in place, just in principle. So not totally written in stone. This has been around since about 2003, this invest model. So if people start talking about stories and invest, it's just a great guideline. Is it gospel? No. If you violate some of these, then maybe you want to have some different conversations about writing your story. That's what it's designed for. So please don't go home and say, Lisa said that I have to use invest, and if we don't check all these boxes, this is not a ready story. Not true, but this is a great guideline. So you're going to have to, and you're going to have to juggle some of these, right? Like, so you may have to skimp a little on the value side in order to get an independent story, right? So this is a juggling act really with these things. So it's not all of them have to be checked. It's simply use your good judgment. It's give and take. You're going to have to focus on some at the expense of others, and that's okay. So invest is a great set of criteria for judging when a story is ready to get its estimates from the dev team. What is small? Well, as I mentioned, you want to be able to complete several of them in a sprint. And what that looks like for your team is really up to your team. I'll give you some guidelines later, but small means that you don't have an enormous story that's going to take weeks to do and roll from sprint to sprint, et cetera, et cetera. It means that it's not a batch. If you're familiar with lean principles, we know that batches are bad. You can quote me on that. Batches are bad. We want nice, small, single batch type things if you can get away with it. Really, if you've got tons of bullet points on your requirements, if you're in Jira and the description field has 15 bullet points, that's a batch. That's a bunch of different kinds of things that have to happen and be coded and be tested. So we're trying to avoid batches. So multiples of them in a sprint, avoiding batches, and also it is a narrow vertical slice of software. So it should be demonstrating that the system is working. If you have a button to click, then you should be able to click the button and do something with it as a result of that story. Now you may go to a blank page that's not complete, or the button may be the only thing on the page that you've completed, but that would be a vertical slice. So you click the button, something actually happens, not a UI story for the button. And then I'm going to do this one, and then we'll shoot over to Audrey and let her let us know what kinds of questions are coming in. And one of the questions I get a lot when I'm working with teams and managers is, why do you keep insisting that stories be small? Because I'm pretty vigilant about that. It's like, I don't care what you do, just make it small, basically. One of the reasons is that these single stories, when they're very small, tend to be more uniform in size. And if you think of lean, that came from the world of manufacturing, where things tend to be uniform, and the standard deviation is pretty small, meaning that the range of variability is pretty small. So if your average is 50, it's not because you've got ones and hundreds, it's because you've got 49s and 51s. And so that gives you a lot more predictability. So when you have nice small stories, which are not manufacturing of widgets, this is thought work, this is creative, there are lots of unknowns and high risk situations when you're writing software, the smaller you can make them to be a complete whole, the more you are sort of approximating as best we can in this kind of environment that really uniform sort of manufacturing of things that are all identical. Another great reason is that we suck at estimating big stuff. I mean, it's just a fact of having brains that work the way human brains work. We're terrible at estimating big stuff. we're terrible at 5s and 8s and 13s. We might as well just put, throw a dart at a dartboard and pick a random number when we get up that big. We're pretty good at estimating small stuff. So one of the reasons we keep encouraging people to break down stories that are 5s, or at least be thinking about it when they're 5s, but definitely when they're 8s, is because what tends to happen is your 8 will become 4 stories that are all 3 points apiece. And that is actually 12 story points. And that's a better estimate than kind of making the shot in the dark about the 8. Large stuff, we are terrible at estimating. We're good at small stuff. So keep it small. You'll get better estimates, and that will allow your teams to be more predictable. And then finally, and this is something that a lot of people don't think about, when we just, again, as human beings, when we complete something, it feels really good. It feels good to move a thing to done. We get a little hit of whatever those chemicals are, the happy feel good chemicals are in our brains when we finish something, when we accomplish something. And even if you're not aware that it's happening, it is happening. It feels good to complete something. So if you have a sprint where you're just banging away at the story that you've been trying to finish for the last 3 sprints, it's really a downer. But if you're in a sprint where every day you or somebody else is completing something, like moving to done, completely done, it maintains this happy feel good chemical in the brain, and you actually wind up with a happier team. And we all know that happy teams are more trusting teams. They're more open, they get more stuff done, they have quicker, better process improvements, they have open conversations. And so you want to generate this happiness within your team from getting just a series of small wins over and over and over again, just to keep that enjoyment up. So in addition to all the process lean kind of stuff, we also have a people factor here that's very important. So I'm going to pause there. Audrey, what else? What other questions do we have coming down the pike?
Well, thank you so much, everyone who has given us questions. And I will say we've got folks from all kinds of different levels of experience with this. So I wanted to do a couple of questions that do cover some more basics. Back to your first slides. One is, who writes the stories, Lisa? And where should they be captured and tracked?
Ah, great question. Your stories, and I don't care what your title is, so I'm going to avoid titles like PO or BA or PM or project manager or whatever. I'm going to avoid all of that. The person who should be writing your stories is this person. I want you to think of whoever it is in your organization that works closely with your Scrum team, your team that's implementing this work, who understands the product vision and is able to make decisions at the level of, does this thing go on the left or the right? When I move from this page to that page, what does that flow look like? So it needs to be a person who understands the product vision and can make those lower level, not strategic decisions, but those lower level decisions about what the user experience is going to be. And I don't mean that this has to be a UX person, but you're probably working in concert with a UX person to understand what the problem is that's being solved and how you're going to solve it for whichever user you've chosen. So it is typically the person who is sort of in charge of prioritizing and imagining the product backlog at the smaller scale of work that's going to be executed by the Scrum team. In the Scrum world, we call that a Scrum PO, but I've seen that kind of role called everything under the sun. So I'm going to avoid all those other names, but that would be what we would call a Scrum PO if you're doing it strictly by the book, but not every organization does. So you just have to think of who that person is, and that's the person who would be writing your stories.
Perfect. Let's just do one more. This could go on. What should the user story contain, and what should the acceptance criteria contain? Now, I will put a link to your blog about gherkins in the chat.
Great. I think we can do one more because that one is either going to be answered in a later slide here, or it's in my my other webinars, blogs, and videos on writing, the actual writing of gherkins. So maybe we could do one more, Audrey.
All right. So then, let's pick a good one. How about this one? How do you guide a team on how to distinguish the difference with technical versus functional stories?
Oh, that's a great question. I love that one. My thought is always, if you can't, no matter what you're doing in software, in some way, shape, or form, usually has an impact on the end user. And I don't use the word end user a lot because I like to think more in terms of a lot more strategically and specifically about who you're doing the work for. But in this case, it makes sense. So even if you're doing a technical task, even if you're automating some process, it's very likely that you're changing the experience at the end of the line for some user. Like maybe it's a performance thing, so the page doesn't take quite as long to load. If you can draw that thread on a technical task pretty easily to a change in experience for the end user, then try to write your user story from the user's perspective. So this is the customer's perspective. If at all possible, try that. I'm not saying you have to again be just really hard-nosed about it, but generally speaking, start thinking about even your technical tasks usually have something at the end that is going to manifest to the user, even if it's just like performance. Even upgrades, sometimes you can draw that thread all the way to how this is going to change the user's experience. If it's fairly, I mean, with a little work, you can draw that thread. Go ahead and try to write the story from the user's perspective. If you're doing a pure technical task where it just kind of doesn't seem like that's something that you can like if you're, I don't know, if you're installing a dev tool, for example, like you probably just write that as a regular task and write that in whatever the natural language is for developers, right? So it doesn't have to be, plain English, because sometimes it's hard to write those technical tasks that way. So that is how I would distinguish between the two in general terms. And there's lots of gray area, but if you can draw the thread, try it that way. And if it becomes too onerous, like too much cognitive load to really try to shoehorn a technical task into a user-centric language-based story, then don't worry about it. Okay, we're gonna please continue to write your questions in the chat. We do actually save these. We will wrap all of these questions up into future webinars as well. So I'm going to move on to the next slide. We're going to answer a couple of questions possibly in the next few slides, and then we'll have another opportunity at the end to hear more of your questions, okay? What if a large story can't be split up? I cannot tell you how many times I have heard this from teams that are just getting going with this. There's no way this can be smaller than an 8. I can tell you right now that 99.9% of the time, it can be smaller than an 8, and it is rare, very rare, that a large story can't be broken up. What's not rare is that people aren't used to the ways in which you can break up a story, and so they don't think along those lines. And so to them, this looks like this giant monolithic thing that has to be 8 story points, and there's no way you can break it up. Generally speaking, I would say that is not the case, and you just have to think creatively about how to break it up. And the next question is going to be, well, how do we do that? So once you learn some of these techniques, you can slowly start chipping away at these stories and carving off little slices and making them slightly smaller and reducing the risk and getting better estimates by doing that. It's not that it never happens. It's simply that most of the time it can actually be broken up. And you might actually wind up with an 8 sometimes, and that's okay if that's the exception and not the rule. And so how do we break up these stories? So yeah, okay, great. We've got all these enormous stories. They're rolling over from sprint to sprint. How, it doesn't look like we can break it up. So what are some ways in which we can do that? This is another acronym, because obviously we're Agile. We love our acronyms. And it's SPIDER, S-P-I-D-R, no E in there. So it's like a little bug, but without the E in it, so SPIDER. And that stands for 5 different sort of lenses you can put a story under to look at and see if you can find any little cracks where you might be able to cleave off pieces of it. The first one is spikes. A lot of times, if you remember from my story point webinar and series, story points have 3 components. It's effort, complexity, and risk. And oftentimes that risk is simply because there are so many unknowns. And so a story that might otherwise not be very difficult might wind up with higher story points because there's just so many unknowns. And so a spike, this is the S in the SPIDER acronym, a spike can be used as a research task. It's a way to time box your story. So you say, we're going to spend 4 hours investigating this to reduce some of those unknowns so that we can give you a better estimate after, in some grooming after that. So you can carve off a little piece, just create a spike, leave that big old story over there that, that has lots of unknowns. Go do your research spike and then reinvestigate that story and see if you can see areas, number one, areas where you might be able to break it up, or number two, at least reduce that risk a little bit. And if you need another spike, have another spike. Just time box it, 4 hours, 8 hours, whatever you think. And the reason, I will tell you this for you engineers on the line, I get it. We all want to solve problems. Sometimes you just find yourself down a rabbit hole and you feel like the answer has to be perfect and completely solutioned before you stop doing your research into it. Time boxing is a very effective way to force us to focus and to not let us wind up spending the entire sprint looking into one thing. It's just sometimes the hours that are spent doing that, it's not worth the cost. The benefit that you get from spending the additional hours isn't worth the cost. So just time box it. And then if you run out of time and you really feel like that wasn't long enough to reduce the risk, then go ahead and create another spike. The other thing is paths. So we did spider, S-P-I-D-R. This is P, paths. This means the workflow. Think about the bare minimum workflow that's required. That means try the happy path first. Try the shortest happy path first. Try the shortest, least complex happy path for a specific persona first before you feel like you have to write the whole entire path as a single story. In other words, in Amazon, my path from finding an item to getting it to my front door, I've got all kinds of options. I can choose store credit cards. I can choose whether I want it delivered on my Amazon day. I can pick addresses. I can pick gift wrapping. I can search. I can, compare. When you think about it, the only thing I really need to be able to do is to identify the thing I need, supply an address, and supply payment information. That's really it. And that is the happy path, those 3 steps. So think about stripping away all of the unhappy paths and all the options and get that first thing done. Sometimes that can help you split up a story. Interfaces is another one. This means, if it doesn't work, if it works in Chrome but not in, IE 10, split those stories up, right? Like do the Chrome version and do the IE 10, or do the, the Android version separate from the iOS version, whatever it is. So it's kind of like your interfaces. Data, same thing. If you're doing data migration, split that up so that you're using only the most critical data. You don't always have to port everything over. Maybe you only need a couple of fields. Make sure that works first. Once you get, an idea that those fields work, then you can bring over all your archive data and all the weird things and the edge cases and whatever. So just be thinking about, well, what's the most important one? A very tiny thing that we can do. Remember, simply to test that the system works. You just want to be sure that everything's talking and passing information correctly. Rules, give up your business rules. A lot of people cringe at this. It doesn't matter. Forget about performance. You can put performance as a separate story if you need to. You can put, validations as a great example of a separate story if you want to. You don't have to have a login screen, have both the login and the, with all its validations and the password with all its validations, right? Like you can just start with a blank thing, and I don't really care what thing you put in there. There's no validations. It's one thing. You don't even need also a password, and then you can move to the next page. Now, are you going to go live with that? No, but you can break up the work like that. So this is what splitting up the stories is all about. It is about breaking up the work. You will choose to deploy them in bundles that make sense, like you're not going to go live with a story that's simply the creation of a blank web page. But as you're breaking up the work, you would work on just creating that web page and test it and make sure that's there. And then you would slowly start building the elements that are part of that web page. And then at the end, when all that's done, then you would deploy it all together. But you're going to work on it on small pieces to keep it flowing through the system. So if you're doing small pieces, you kind of want to know, well, what do we include in there? If you're not used to Agile, there's no such thing as a BRD or a business requirements document in the Agile world. We don't have tons and tons and tons of requirements and technical specs and all of that stuff, but we do need enough language for the dev team to know what to code and test. So use natural language. Use Gherkins, as Audrey mentioned. I have a webinar and a blog and videos on using Gherkins. They're great. It's just the given, when, then format. It's kind of similar, if you think about it, to steps to reproduce in a bug where it says, I'm in this context, when I do this, I would expect to see this, but instead I see that. It's kind of similar, but it's not for bugs. It's given that I'm here, when I, do this, then this happens, or this is the anticipated thing to happen. And then if you need to add additional notes, sometimes the product people have insight into things that the dev team might need to know. You feel free to add that as well. But it should be really crisp, really small, really concise, and very, very, very clear. And how many points? I get this question a lot because now people are like, okay, well, our stories are all 5 story points, and we feel like that's small. Or, what is the general range that we're looking for? So we do want a narrow range. We want to make sure that we're don't have a lot of variability, like we don't have tons of 1s and tons of 8s and 13s. We want to get it in a very narrow range. And for small, when you're using Fibonacci, that's 1s, 2s, and 3s. If your stories are generally in that range of 1s, 2s, and 3s, and that means that it's not taking more than a few days to do, and again, you can get multiples of them done in your sprint. If you're in that range, that's a nice sweet spot for how many story points should be on a story. Now remember, 1 is always the smallest unit for story points. It's the smallest kind of work you get. So you can't be smaller than a 1. So that 1 to 3 range is generally pretty good for this kind of work that we do in engineering. Can we split dev and QA into different stories? Single word answer, no. No, you may not. That is not how we do this. This is not, absolutely not, I will repeat, this is not one of the ways in which you can split up a story. Do not ever, 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 ever split up dev and QA. Do not ever, ever, ever split up UI, middle tier, and back end. Those are not allowed. There are lots of ways you can slice up a story, but those are 2 that are definitely not the ways you can do it. Do not do that. Your story needs to include everything in your definition of done, which everywhere that I've worked in software includes the development, the coding, and the testing as well. So your story needs to be written to include all of those things. And finally, our last question before we get into more questions from the group is one that comes up a lot, is how small is too small? What we're looking at here is the average transaction cost per story, still in that sweet spot? I've worked with a couple of clients who have this really hairy, clunky, onerous, large process in place from, sort of an artifact of the fact that the, rest of the organization is fairly waterfall, for doing just a deployment to an integration environment. And so, yeah, you don't want an itty bitty 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 story, being deployed. Like they're very far away from CI/CDs, continuous integration, continuous deployment, because the cost of taking that step is so huge that they kind of have to do that in batches. So they do, save up stories and then do that if they can. So there's still these tiny units, these tiny complete units, but they do have to sometimes work in batches because the overhead for doing that move to the next environment is so incredibly high, and it's really what's slowing the teams down. But you have to make that judgment call. When you're in CI/CD, it's like there's almost like no small is too small. You just, whatever it takes to just move things through. But you do have to kind of bear that in mind and weigh that balance. What usually is not the case is when like devs are in there going, well, I'm already in there, I might as well, just change these 5 things. Because you have to remember that a story includes also the QA that's involved, the testing that's involved. And so, yeah, it might be change 1 line of code for the devs, but the QA really needs that story broken up so that they can test a very specific thing. And it might be easier for the dev, but we're not going to optimize locally there. We're going to optimize the system, which means we also have to take the QA part into consideration. So that is my the most common questions I get. So we're going to go back to Audrey, and here's some other questions.